From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, where we assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. And obviously, at this moment, there is only one contemporary issue, problem, and event. So that's where we are. I'm John Plotz, and our RTB guest today is the amazing medievalist Seeta Chaganti, whose books include The Medieval Poetics of the Reliquary and Strange Footing. Did I get that right? Is it called Strange Footing still? Which is this great book about poetic form in the Middle Ages, understood as a multimedia experience shaped by encounters with dance. And Seeta, I've loved talking with you about that project over the years. It's such a cool project. And so this is another installment of our Books in Dark Times series, which, as you probably know by now, explicitly takes its inspiration from Hannah Arendt's Men in Dark Times, which proposes that even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination, and that such illumination may well come less from theories and concepts than from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under almost all circumstances. So at this dark moment, our idea is to talk to people about what brings them some kind of illumination, some kind of comfort or joy. And so we want to know that about Seeta. We want to know about you, dear listener. So have a listen and then ideally send us your own thoughts as well. So Seeta, welcome. It's really fun to talk to you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be on the show.
Cool. And so Seeta, can I just start off by pointing out that when we talked before, you really kind of opened my mind because we use the words comfort and joy as a sort of frame for this, but you talked about works that sustain and engage you. So do you mind if I just ask you to talk about that? Because that seems like a great way to start off.
I'd love to talk about that a little. And I think that those terms are actually related to a way that I wanted to respond to your introduction, in fact, in which you, in many ways are rightly saying that there is one big issue that we're responding to right now, and we're kind of looking for possible ways of, moments of illumination within this very dark time, as you say. And I, when you initially invited me to speak on this show, one of my thoughts was that I would really like to remind everyone that in addition to the COVID-19 crisis that is happening right now, it's important for us to remember other significant phenomena that are occurring kind of within that context and the ways in which they speak to each other. I am a UC Davis faculty member, and some readers may be aware that the University of California has been involved in what is becoming a system-wide wildcat strike on the part of the graduate students right now. And so I've been very interested in the rhetoric that is emerging about the relationship between the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly the ways in which many universities, including the UC, have been responding to it, and what this means for us to see some significant changes in how we approach education and this kind of increased dominance of digital platforms in education, all of that, how that relates to some of the issues that had already been raised in the wildcat strike that have to do with teaching conditions and various kinds of inequities that, that the graduate students and the undergraduates in the UC system are facing. And so in thinking about a book to talk about today, I wanted to look at something that would respond to all of that together and acknowledge that even though it feels like we just have one big issue that we're thinking about right now, it's important for us to understand that, a lot of other kind of really important political work, labor actions, have happened in the midst of these other sorts of world historical crises, and that the relationship between those different phenomena are really important. I'm going to just provide a little bit more of a frame for the book that I want to talk about, which is, the book that I chose to focus on is W.E.B. Bois's Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, which is edited by Whitney Battle-Baptiste and Rick Russert. And it sounds like perhaps a somewhat unlikely choice for a medievalist, which is how you introduced me. And in many ways it is, but I was thinking about this actually and why this book spoke to me and what it had to do with my kind of larger intellectual persona. And one of the things that I realized in thinking about your question was that I do think that the books that sustain and engage me often combine different media. I think that's always been true, and so that could mean I think in my childhood, it did mean picture books, which have left, in which the visual medium has left really lasting impression on me in many instances. But I think it's also very related to becoming a medievalist, which involves a book and manuscript culture that just understands the place of visual and other kinds of media within the book, and how they operate very differently from how we might think of, in a more modern context. When we are asked, what's a book that comforts you, we might often think of a novel or, something where that pictorial element is not really a kind of fundamental component of it. And so I think, and so a lot of my, both my interest and my training, I think, really predisposes me to being really, again, sustained by the exercise of thinking about relationships between visual images and text in a book, and kind of understanding, what kind of truth is uniquely being communicated here through that interaction. And so that's the reason why I chose this book, which for listeners who are not familiar with it, it collects a set of a little bit over 60 sort of poster boards, I guess, that W.E. Du Bois made in collaboration with a school of sociologists at Atlanta University, which were intended to be and were exhibited at the Paris World's Fair exhibition in 1900 as part of a component of that exhibition that was supposed to show its viewers something about Black life in America.
Right. And so Seeta, I'm sure our listeners know about Du Bois as the author of Souls of Black Folk, and they understand him as an incredibly important African-American intellectual, but can you fill in the back picture of his relationship to academia, or how he came to be working at Atlanta University?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, John, I don't have a lot of information about that, but what I feel like I can talk about a little is Du Bois's interest in sociology as a discipline, you know, and the ways in which it, like many other kinds of academic disciplines, is, has a presumption to subscribing to certain kinds of hegemonic methodologies. And Du Bois was very interested in interrogating some of those assumptions behind disciplinary method in sociology that would make it a more just field, and one that, that could actually act towards racial justice and economic justice, in a different kind of way. And I think, the World's Fair opportunity, this was not the only way in which Du Bois was engaged in that World's Fair. He consulted on other aspects of it as well. And I think it's this interesting moment of Du Bois kind of, on the one hand, wanting to present a certain kind of picture of Black life, in the United States in some positive and affirming ways that were, that may have been the kind of traditional way of thinking about this, but also wanting to be really clear about how to manifest these social inequities, and to make very clear that these inequities are systemic and are not derived from the kinds of racial hierarchizing, that many of the American and European visitors to the exhibit might have, that might have been an assumption that many of them brought along. And so I think that's something that was really important to him to undermine.
Cool. And so, see, just as I was frantically Wikipediaing as we were speaking, and I was just trying to figure out the chronology. So, Souls of Black Folk is actually 3 years after these diagrams come out, and his first couple of books, The Study of the Negro Problems and the Philadelphia Negro, and The Negro in Business, those are all sort of more sociological books that he was publishing pre-1900.
Yeah.
And, he was studying in Germany. He got a PhD at Harvard, I think. I think he was the first African-American to get a PhD at Harvard. Mm-hmm. So it's just interesting to think about the analytic underpinning of a book, of later work that is of course analytic, but also so poetical and literary as well.
Yeah, so, and kind of differently activist in focus, I guess. But I do think that activist consciousness is there, just again in kind of thinking about scholarly methodology. I think to interrogate traditional scholarly methodologies is in itself a form of activism. And it's also, I think one of the things that becomes evident in some of these plates, particularly in the earlier ones, is his interest in the relationship between Black life in the United States and Africa, and so that also, so he's really, I think throughout his career, he's kind of negotiating what that relationship should look like, and how to understand Africa, how to understand, the kind of American consciousness of Africa, as well as Africa on its own terms. And so that, that's also something that continues to emerge in his political writing.
That's great. So can you talk about one particular plate that you find intensely engaging or sustaining, I guess?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. Just to come back to our earlier theme, one of the things that really struck me about the collection as a whole is how many of the plates are interested in education and in, and in statistics about education. And so let's see, I'm just looking at plates 49 and 50 if you want to kind of let you know. So these are, so these are two juxtaposed plates in which we have these, in which Du Bois and his collaborators are experimenting with graphic art to kind of make often quite trenchant points about what is happening for Black Americans and what kind of impact education might have on them. So he does, in this plate that I'm looking at, he uses a very sort of limited color palette that's just black and red. And so, and so he makes a lot of, or the whole group, I guess, makes a lot of really deliberate choices about how they are going to use color and contrast in color to show both the existence of inequities and the extent to which Black Americans have really engaged themselves productively in opportunities that are there when they are provided, to sort of enter into society in a different kind of way to combat the dispossession that they, that they've found themselves placed within. And there's also a very interesting chart about illiteracy, about the illiteracy of Black Americans in comparison to other countries. And that one also, it uses color in this really striking way by singling out the bar that represents Black Americans as opposed to all these other countries. So in one sense, it seems distinct, but in another sense, the way that the bars are arranged on the page, it becomes very clear. And I think this is a pointed comment to viewers at the, at the Paris exhibition, that there are many other European countries that have much higher illiteracy rates, or lower literacy rates, and so it's again, this attempt to use these nonverbal means, very subtly, but very powerfully to combat various kinds of systemically generated perceptions.
So Seeta, I want to come back to that point you made earlier about being a medievalist, ergo, you're someone who thinks about, I guess ekphrastic is the wrong question, but you're thinking about the symbiosis or the interplay between the visual and the textual. When you pick up this book and you find this book engaging, is it engaging to you because it seems to indicate a way forward in which like the modern world could do the same thing that those medieval texts did that you like so much? Or is it more like a path not taken? Like you feel like that it would have been great if what Du Bois did could, continue to define scholarship, but it doesn't? Like, how do you think about this book?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I'm sort of ever the optimist, and I'm always kind of hoping that, that anything that, that allows us to think in some new, interesting way could be a path forward to, to something better. And I think it's kind of hard to kind of carry yourself along day by day without, without thinking about that. And I think for me, and your question about the medievalist training and what that brings to, to this inquiry is, I think, an important one for me and something that I thought a lot about. And I think for me, it boils down to this idea that medieval cultural productions, like manuscripts that have pictures in them, or wall paintings that that have poetic text at the bottom and images at the top, they create these really interesting opportunities to find asymmetries and disorientations within what look like apparent symmetries. I think in ways that working in a single medium is it's not as possible to do. And that's a lot of what the book Strange Footing that you mentioned was about. Particularly because dance is an art form, particularly early dance is an art form that people tend to associate with, harmony and celestial spheres and all that stuff. And I was really interested in looking at how multimedia representations of dance and mixed media representations of dance were able to kind of cast into relief for us all of these little disorientations and asymmetries and slippages that happen within something that looks, really something that has a lot of periodicity and a lot of symmetry, and visual harmony. And that, I think, is what really helped me to approach the Du Bois, because, partly what they're doing is experimenting with ways to make data visualization really beautiful and harmonious, and they succeed in many different respects. They have all kinds of really interesting kind of graphic experiments they do with mixing typefaces and with changing bar graphs into spirals, so that a graph that would ordinarily be a bunch of straight lines becomes something kind of circular and curvilinear. So so there's a lot of really, really stunning visual experimentation. And I think that for me, what that really opened up for me was the ability to see how carefully and how brilliantly these boards, these placards, are drawing attention to and sort of non-verbally commenting on all of these disorientations, inequities, asymmetries, things that, injustices, irritants, all of these things that, that keep this society from being what it is, how they are actually rendered even more powerfully through the means of these very symmetrical kinds of visual images. It will be a little surprising to anybody who listens to this who actually knows me that I chose this book, because really I'm a poetry person. I like the fact that I didn't choose a poetry book is significant in some ways, but I think it is because, like, you asked me to really sort of, think in that most inward plane about what kind of thing actually, I respond to in some very deep way. And I really think it's pictures, or like the relationship of text and pictures, which obviously there's poetry that, that involves that also, but a lot of it is medieval poetry,
Well, no, it's interesting. I actually I'm waiting for my first poetry discussion. Like I keep thinking someone's going to talk about Auden or Shakespeare or Wyatt or anything, but so far I've asked a couple of people and they've just like swatted it away. So
really,
it's interesting. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. And now I'm thinking I could also have talked about Troilus and Crusade.
A lot of people I've talked to have mentioned P.G. Wodehouse, for example. So clearly, like, there's one set of people who are just kind of diving into like comfort food, I guess you could call it. Yeah. And that clearly does not seem to be your impulse at this moment. And so that is interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was, and I was thinking about this because I was also, after listening to the talk you had with Alex Starr, I was thinking about like other directions this could have gone in, and, what I could have done. And I definitely understand that impulse to turn towards particularly novels. Again, I think just because, there's this way in which they create this other world for you to belong, even if it's a very realist, even if it's a very naturalistic kind of world, the impulse to like one of the novels I was thinking about was something like Anna Karenina, right? Where, like you get to the end of that novel and like you're sad because you were in this world with these people and you thought you were part of that world, and now it's over, and what are you going to do next? And, I definitely remember feeling that even reading it as a 15-year-old, so back to the children's book theme.
And you're not saying sad because of what happens within the book. You're saying sad that
just that you're that was a finite world that had an ending, or that that if it does go on, you don't get to go on with it. Like that. I remember just feeling very sad about that. But I think
that's one of the reasons those Narnia books feel so manipulative at the end, because you know what I mean? Because the narrative arc insists, okay, it's so wonderful to be in this other space, but we know how that works. And then the last battle just kind of torques that and says, well, Susan is bad because she's not a good Christian girl. She gets expelled, and the rest of them just get to go on and on into the inner Narnia and the inner Narnia. And you just feel, oh, what a rock, Yeah,
it's true. And it's true that I think, the Narnia books, kind of return us to the medieval theme again, in a lot of ways, just because like that was an important mine for, for Lewis and coming up with a lot of that imagery and those traditions. And I do think, just to come back to your question about, the choice, like what kinds of books I choose, I do think a lot of it, again, it does have to do with the fact that when you read a lot of medieval literature, you aren't really expecting it to do the same thing that a 19th century novel is expecting. You're expecting a 19th century novel to do. I mean, in a lot of ways, it is always going to feel like a pretty alien world, what you're looking at. I've never had that experience. I don't feel immersed reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the world of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And maybe there are other medievalists who do. I've never been one of those medievalists, I'm very conscious of that being an English tradition that I'm not really part of. And, and so I
interesting.
Yeah. And so I don't, so I just don't, so in thinking about your question, I wasn't really bringing that set of expectations to the books I was thinking of. The set of expectations I was bringing had more to do with what is going to allow me to see something interesting and engaging that might provide a way forward out of many of the crises that we're facing right now.
Yeah.
I think, again, like one of the reasons that I am really drawn to Du Bois is that I really like to think kind of meta-discursively and methodologically, you know. And so for me, like, for example, as I was talking about before, like for me, the method of trying to do what a medieval reader does with a kind of multimedia text, like that is a helpful method to me for thinking about like what I could draw from what Du Bois and his Atlanta School of Sociologists are doing here that might be useful to think about. And so I really tend to kind of think more in those sort of more the back of the tapestry than the front of the tapestry, I guess, you know.
Yeah, the back of the tapestry. Oh man, I love back of the tapestry analogy. That's the heart of my favorite book, House of Mirth, where they say Lily Barth is behind the tapestry where the knotted ends hang.
Yeah, Wharton is actually, I mean, you know, in your question about sort of categories of those kinds of books that are, you know, that can be comforting that way. I mean, Wharton is another one, but you know, those books are gut wrenching, but there's also something about them that.
So comforting in their gut wrenchingness?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's right.
Which ones are you thinking of? House of Mirth, Age of Innocence?
Age of Innocence, really. But also like Ethan Frome, I really, you know, like even something like Ethan Frome is just, I know.
Kill me now.
They're such difficult books, but she, you know, like I just kind of, she was, you know, and she was a super problematic figure herself in many ways, but you know, she just had a really interesting eye. You know, again, like they're very visual books, you know, and everybody, like, I'm the only person who liked that Scorsese adaptation of The Age of Innocence.
No, I'm with you. I thought that was great.
Did you like it?
I
thought
totally
it was really
agree.
good because I really felt like the thing that adaptation did was it tried to inhabit her eye, you know, like it really, you know, like it was very attuned to what particular kinds of visual details she noticed. And I think it did a really nice job, like taking those visual details to produce this reading of the book and to kind of emphasize this idea that, to emphasize Newland Archer's blindness, essentially, that, you know, he's thinking that he sees things that other people don't see all along, when in fact he's failed to see something really important that everyone else basically saw the entire time, you know. And I think the visual reading of that in a way that Scorsese sort of lit and blocked the whole thing, like I thought that worked really well.
Not only am I with you, but are you also a fan of the Jane Campion Portrait of a Lady? Because
I think I've never seen it.
Oh my God, I love it for the same reason. Like it just travels with lines of sight so incredibly. Like it just sits you in Isabel Archer's ignorance and in her moments of illumination. And I just love, it's like a very particular and sort of torqued account of the novel, but I think it's amazing, you know.
And I think lines of sight is an important phrase, because I mean, again, I'm trying to think as we're talking about, you know, all the different things that I would like to say about how amazing these Du Bois, you know, these Du Boisian objects are. And I think that idea of line of sight is also really important. And that, you know, and the introductory matter to the book talks a lot about how he is really anticipating and ahead of certain kinds of modernist aesthetics, and, you know, and the ways that they are experimenting with lines of sight and with proportion, and, you know, and kind of mixing different kinds of textual expression, you know, that sort of thing. And I think that's, you know, and I think the subtlety of that to, you know, to make these points about really glaring systemic inequities without making them verbally, you know, I think that's, you know, that's also something really powerful that needs to be acknowledged about what Du Bois is doing here.
Yeah, well, so I mean, boy, Seeta, that's a whole nother conversation we could have, because it sort of relates to a way of thinking about those debates around early film, where Eisenstein is championing montage, and, you know, people like Bazin are championing, hard word to say, championing deep focus. And so you think about montage and deep focus as being alternative accounts of what the rectangle of the film frame can do, but maybe we need to think about those other kinds of lines of sight as well as, you know, another possibility that's enabled by the rectangle of the printed page. So yeah, I mean, 1900 is a really exciting moment for how visual and textual are supposed to interact, because
it turns out. I mean, that's the thing. Like, this is really out of my field. So I feel like I don't have the kind of rich context that you do for thinking about what 1900 means. I'm just sort of looking at this one particular instance.
It's great. I mean, there's a great book by Linda Need called, I think, maybe The Speed of the Moving Image or something, where she's just interested in how visual materials can be so readily put before the eyes of audiences by the end of the 19th century because of publication technology changes, and the implications of that for the visual and the textual going together, maybe in ways that do revert back to medieval patterns.
I think that would, because again, to come back to the question you were asking before about William Morris, like, I do think that sort of dichotomizing impulse between one kind of temporality and another, like, I think that's a kind of modern limitation, that in fact, I don't, and I think maybe that is one of the other things that I find so compelling about the Du Bois, is that I think it's not, it's not really subscribing to either a sort of serial form, or an attempt to kind of grab you instantaneously with something visual. I actually don't think either one of those things is going on. I think it's actually finding this way to create a sort of, interwoven narrative that gets you to experience it in time in a much more complicated way.
Yeah. So just as, I feel like one of the big things that we debate now is this whole question of like how to lie with numbers. And maybe there's another counterpart to how to lie with numbers, which is like how to tell the truth with pictures. And, that's a story that we are seeing increasingly in the 21st century. And
that's true. Yeah. And it comes back to, we had talked about this a little bit earlier, but it comes back again to this, all of these questions about uses of data and how we educate each other also, right? And this, this kind of, this false sense, and there's a great piece about this that we can put the link up to somewhere that that makes this point that this turn during the COVID epidemic to instruction that is digitally based and that is and that is kind of data driven in many ways, it creates this false sense that the format in which that instruction takes place, because it's basically a STEM-based format in a lot of ways, it's neutral, right? And so you can communicate any kind of content in it neutrally, but of course it's not neutral, right? I mean, there's all kinds of other underlying ideologies for those kinds of platforms, and and concerns around surveillance and concern, all kinds of ways in which the platform of education that's been chosen now, that is apparently a sort of default, is actually not a neutral platform at all. And so I think the Du Bois also does a really interesting job kind of foregrounding how these acts of converting data in various ways, or these acts of sort of presenting what would seem to be objective or quantified data, are always kind of ideologically driven and are never just sort of neutral formats.
Yeah. Okay, well, Seeta, from one chicken lover to another, I have to thank you. That was amazing. And I'll just quickly read the credits and say that Recall This Book is hosted by John Plotz and usually Elizabeth Ferry, with music by Eric Cheslow and Barbara Cassidy, and sound editing by Claire Ogden, website design and social media by Kaliska Ross. And we always want to hear from you, especially now, with your comments, your suggestions, your criticisms, and also the books that you are reading at the moment. So email us directly or contact us via social media or our website, or just using the hashtag Books in Dark Times. And so if you enjoyed today's show, please be sure to write a review or rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. And please check out the other Books in Dark Time conversations, including with Alex Starr, Martin Puchner, Carla Rotella, and Elizabeth and I also have one, which was extremely fun, which was also about the late 19th century. So, Seeta, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to you all for listening.